Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, carrying on with the Booker long list for 2023, we have Sebastian Barry's Old God's Time. And this is one of those odd ones in the sense that I reviewed this book reading it a fair bit pre-Booker, before the long list announcement at least. And now I'm sort of trying to go back and review it separately as part of the series of all of the long listed books. But anyway, as with my other solo reviews of the books from the long list, I will go into some spoilers, but that will be sort of signposted before I do. But the first part should be me just sort of talking about broadly the kinds of things that you would know from having read the synopsis even. So not sort of a great deal, much more than that. So let's get started on this book. So, as with many of Sebastian Barry's books, Old God's Time focuses on this sort of beautiful writing that kind of tells a deep story about something profound, often involving memory and looking back over time. The other Sebastian Barry books I've read before, A Long, Long Way, other books whose names I now apparently cannot remember, are just phenomenal. I think Days Without End, for example, as well. He is a writer who I just think cannot really construct a boring sentence. He is incredibly poetic and masterful with his craft, I think. And I'm also now being attacked by the sun. But that's what I think is a really quite special thing about this book, is even sort of in the quieter moments, in the moments where it's sort of less focused on plot and more focused on a character reminiscing. This book is so beautifully and poetically written, and so I think it's one of those books where, for me, you know, generally speaking, the writing comes first and the plot is second for me in terms of my enjoyment often. And this is definitely a book where I think both are very well achieved. The main idea behind this book is that we have this retired policeman, Tom Kettle, and he is looking back over his life and sort of thinking through things. And at first, this book is sort of quite quiet in the sense that it doesn't feel like a great deal is really happening. It doesn't feel like there's a great deal that he has to look back and remember. But then the memories start to come flooding in for him. And what we start to realise is that there is far more going on than we really sort of perceived before. The past is quite a murky place in this book. And it's also worth noting that a lot of where the book goes in terms of talking about memory is incredibly dark and very difficult to read at times. Without spoiling anything, there is at one point a passage that was utterly heartbreaking to read as an audiobook, because I was walking around and then suddenly had sort of really in-depth discussions of an incredibly traumatic and abusive situation. Now, that's not to take away from the power of this book. I think, if anything, that is a big part of the appeal of this book, is the way that it writes about some of the most difficult things with this real sensitivity and writer's eye. There's a way of this being captured in as few words as possible, in some parts, to kind of let the real tragedy of what it is breathe. The character of Tom, in terms of looking back over his life, he has tried to repress so much of his memory. He has tried to move on with his life and continue in a way that doesn't have to deal with the past. But the past in this book catches up with him. It is following him, it's ever present, and it's a past and a history that is incredibly difficult. And this, again, is a book where I think I mentioned it sort of was quite quiet almost at the beginning. This book eventually caught me because it just kept building towards the realization of all of the horrors that he has been keeping hidden throughout all of it. And, you know, the Booker is firstly, he's no sort of stranger to the Booker, Sebastian Barry, having been shortlisted and longlisted before. I think Old God's Time is one of those books where, having read it pre-Booker, I really enjoyed it and thought maybe it's a bookery book, maybe it's not, who knows. It's a tough one to call sometimes. But I think what's really very special about this book is the way that it is able to render so beautifully the ways that memory is incredibly slippy, and it's a very complex thing. This is a man looking back over the sum total of a life and realizing the times when he was potentially oblivious to everything that's going on, and the times where he didn't really do what was necessarily needed, but he couldn't necessarily have known at the time. I realise I'm being incredibly vague about this, partly on purpose because some of this will be very big in the spoiler territory, but also just because I think this book is something to be experienced. I think you need to sort of let this book wash over you in all of the difficulty and poignancy that it has to offer. Whether it will be on the long list or short list remains to be seen. So on the short list rather, will remain to be seen. But at the time of filming, at least, we're still in long list stage, and I think this is just such an incredibly strong and beautifully written book. The main reason I've sort of almost left it out of predictions is because I never know how a book like this is taken. It's sort of just such a rare gem in terms of its beauty of telling. And it's an incredibly quiet book in a way that Sebastian Barry often is, but in a way that I think is really quite special as well. So anyway, on that, from moving away from those vagaries, let's move into some of the spoilers. If you need to drop out here, by all means, feel free to do so. But I'm going to move on to talking about some of the plot points that happen in this book as well. Back in a moment. So with the spoiler curtain down, one of the things I wanted to, or lifted, I don't know which way around that works, the spoiler curtain no longer being in effect, we are talking about spoilers, and one of the things that I think was really quite profound in this book is the way this book in great detail discusses moments of abuse, and particularly child abuse in a setting that is linked with religion to some degree. And it's an incredibly complicated one. This is something that has been a much discussed topic in a lot of British and Irish history recently. You know, other books have touched on what this has really meant as well. You know, if you think even Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan talks about sort of other forms of abuse at the hands of the church with the Magdalene laundries. But this sort of pertains to a very specific piece of abuse, and particularly how our main character then reconciles these memories. He's really pushed down thoughts of this and has not come back to it in his history or in his thoughts. And what we really start to learn is how these moments of abuse really sort of devastatingly affected a set of characters and a set of people in this book. This is what I was saying when I said that the audiobook was an incredibly painful experience at one point, because I was walking and I just had the most intense sort of moment of being, you know, you're walking and it's just sort of surrounding you in your ears, learning about some of the abuse that one of the characters suffers. It's, you know, abuse that is sort of sexual and physical. It has long-term mental ramifications as well for this character. And the thing that is really quite harrowing here as well is the spareness of how it is rendered in this book. It's so easy, I think, with a book talking about the sort of abuse like this, to really feel the need to go into every single grotesque detail of what's happened. And I think Sebastian Barry's skill as a writer is being able to pull back and hold back. And so as intense as that moment is, we don't often get a great amount of the action that's happening, although the emotions of it linger. And I think this is also a very well-read audiobook, in the sense that this is a real moment where the spareness of this book reveals itself, but also leads to this fever pitch of anger. We suddenly get this sort of burning, searing moment in this book that really unsettles Tom Kettle, our protagonist, as he tries to then reconcile everything that's gone on in his life. I think Sebastian Barry is just an incredible writer for how he's managed to pull this scene particularly off. And I almost don't want to go into too much of the other parts of this book, but I think there's so much here in terms of how Sebastian Barry leaves the reader uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable, but also shows just the wider ramifications of this You know, who then reports this? Who then lives with the stories of this? What does justice look like in a situation where something so heinous has happened? All of these are discussed, I think, in All God's Time, and I just think it's a really stunning book in so many ways. It's one that, although I've not necessarily thought about as much as some of the others from the list, it was so brilliantly written that I just left the book feeling that, you know, Sebastian Barry is just, I don't think he can write a bad sentence, essentially. I think he's just an incredibly gifted writer. Anyway, all of that is a rambly way of talking about this book. I think it's an exquisite novel. It's a very difficult and uncomfortable read in many ways. And so if that also sounds like something that you don't think you could quite happily stomach, I totally understand. But it is a book that I think really reveals various layers as it goes. And I think that's its strength as well. I've been Bob the Bookerer talking about this book. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Try to avoid spoilers if you can in the comments. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this book and on Sebastian Barry more broadly. I've been Bob. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.